Two shivering black twin girls huddled at a gas station in the rain. A lonely widower finds them and makes a decision that will change his life forever. George Smith's hand shook as he poured coffee into his chipped mug. The kitchen clock showed 6:30 p.m. Same time as always. He stood at the counter, steam rising from the dark liquid, and stared at the empty chair across the table. Mary's chair. 5 years, and he still couldn't move it. Talking to yourself again, old man, he muttered, running a hand through his white hair. His reflection in the kitchen window showed deep wrinkles around tired eyes. The same eyes that had watched his hardware store for 40 years before retirement forced him to sell it. The coffee burned his tongue. He didn't care. The heat was the only thing that felt real most days. Thunder rumbled outside. The weather forecast had warned about heavy rain tonight. George walked to the living room window and watched dark clouds gather over his quiet suburban street. The neighbors' kids played basketball in their driveway, their shouts carrying through the glass. His phone buzzed. Another text from Linda next door. "Dinner's ready if you'd like to join us, George." He typed back, "Thanks, but not tonight. Already ate." A lie. The sandwich he'd made sat untouched on the kitchen counter. He couldn't remember the last time he'd finished a meal. Mary would have scolded him for that. "You need to eat properly," she'd say, hands on her hips. "What kind of example are you setting for Sarah?" Sarah. His throat tightened. The accident had taken them both, wife and daughter, on a rainy night just like this one. Black ice on the highway. A truck driver who'd worked too many hours. 2 closed caskets. George grabbed his keys. He couldn't stay in this house tonight. Not with the rain and the memories pressing in. The gas station on Milton Street had become his escape. Coffee there tasted terrible, but at least he could watch people coming and going. Sometimes the cashier, Jimmy, would chat about baseball or the weather. His old Ford grumbled to life. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass as the first heavy drops fell. The radio played some new song he didn't recognize. He turned it off. The streets were emptying as the storm picked up. Yellow streetlights reflected off wet asphalt. George drove slowly, hands tight on the wheel. The gas station's bright fluorescent lights cut through the rain ahead. Only 2 cars at the pumps. Perfect. He liked it better when it wasn't busy. He pulled into his usual spot, away from the pumps but with a clear view of the store entrance. The engine died with a familiar rattle. George sat there, watching rain stream down the windshield. A young couple ran from their car to the store, laughing as they got soaked. An old man filling up his truck hunched against the wind. Something caught his eye. Movement near pump number 4. George leaned forward, squinting through the rain-blurred glass. 2 small figures huddled together beside the pump. Kids? His heart skipped. What were children doing out in this weather? He watched them for several minutes. No adult approached. The smaller one, they looked like identical twins, wiped their face with a soggy sleeve. Their summer dresses clung to thin shoulders, dark hair plastered to their heads. "Someone's gonna come for them," George muttered. But nobody did. The couple left with their snacks. The old man drove away. Still, the girls stayed, shivering in the rain. His hands gripped the steering wheel harder. He should call someone. The police maybe. Or just tell Jimmy inside. But the girls' faces, scared, lost, so young, reminded him of Sarah at that age. The time she'd gotten separated from them at the county fair. The terror in her eyes when they finally found her. Damn it! George grabbed his umbrella from the back seat. His knees cracked as he stood. The rain hammered against the umbrella's black canopy as he walked toward pump 4. The girls saw him coming. The taller one, by maybe half an inch, pushed her sister behind her. Their matching brown eyes watched him with a mixture of fear and defiance. Up close, he guessed they were around 6 years old. George stopped several feet away. "Evening," he said softly. "Bit wet to be standing out here." The protective twin squared her tiny shoulders. "We're waiting for someone. Been waiting a while, looks like." George kept his voice gentle. "You must be cold." The smaller girl sneezed. Her sister's stance wavered. "Store's got hot chocolate," George said. "And it's dry inside. Maybe we could wait there instead." The girls exchanged glances. A silent conversation passed between them. "Don't have to," George added quickly. "But the offer's there. I'm George. By the way, George Smith." Another sneeze from the smaller twin. The taller one bit her lip. "I'm Sarah," she said finally. "This is Sophie." George's heart clenched at the name. Sarah. Of course. Nice to meet you both. He held the umbrella out slightly. Shall we get out of this rain? Sarah took her sister's hand. They stepped toward him cautiously, like stray cats approaching food. George held the umbrella over them, letting the rain soak his own shoulders as they walked to the store. The bell chimed as they entered. Jimmy looked up from his phone, eyebrows rising at the sight of George with two soaking wet children. Everything okay, Mr. Smith? Jimmy's hand hovered near the phone. Fine, Jim. Just getting these young ladies some hot chocolate. Still got those paper cups? Jimmy nodded slowly. Behind the coffee machine, George guided the girls to the hot drink station. Their shoes squeaked on the linoleum floor, leaving wet footprints. He filled 2 cups with hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows. Careful now, it's hot, he warned, handing them the cups. They took them with trembling hands. Sarah blew on her drink, eyes darting between George and the door. Sophie took a small sip and closed her eyes, shoulders relaxing slightly. Good? George asked. Sophie nodded. The first almost smile he'd seen from either of them. Want to tell me who you're really waiting for? He kept his tone casual, pulling some napkins from the dispenser. Sarah's grip tightened on her cup. Nobody, she whispered. Nobody. George repeated softly. That's a hard thing. Being alone. Sophie's lower lip trembled. Sarah moved closer to her sister. We ran away, Sophie said suddenly. Sarah shot her a look. From Miss Patricia's. Sophie, I'm sorry, but I'm cold and scared and dash, Sophie's voice broke. George's chest ached. He'd seen enough news stories about foster homes to guess what Miss Patricia's might mean. Hey now, he said gently. It's okay. You're safe here. We'll figure something out. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Please don't call the police. They'll separate us. They always separate twins. George thought of Sarah and Mary, of empty chairs and quiet houses, of how quickly family could slip away. No one's separating anyone tonight, he said firmly. Let's just get warm and dry first. Then we'll talk. Okay. The girls nodded. Outside, the rain continued to fall. George watched them sip their hot chocolate. These 2 small survivors who'd appeared like ghosts in the storm. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He pulled out his phone and found the number for social services. Not to report runaways, not yet, but to ask about becoming a foster parent. At 68. Retired. Alone. You're crazy, old man, he muttered. Sarah looked up. What? Nothing, sweetheart. Just thinking out loud. Say, either of you hungry? Store's got some decent sandwiches. 2 small nods. George smiled and stood, knees protesting. Coming right up. You stay here where it's warm. As he walked to the refrigerator case, he heard Sophie whisper to her sister. He seems nice. Like Grandpa used to be. Maybe, Sarah whispered back. But don't get attached. We never stay anywhere long. George grabbed 3 sandwiches, his hands steady for the first time that evening. These girls needed help. And maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. Jimmy watched from behind the counter as George handed the sandwiches to the twins. His fingers drummed against his phone, uncertainty written across his young face. Mr. Smith, he called out. Can I talk to you for a minute? George patted Sarah's shoulder. Eat up, girls. I'll be right back. At the counter, Jimmy lowered his voice. Should I call someone? Like, authorities or something? Not yet. George glanced back at the girls. Sophie had already devoured half a sandwich. Sarah took smaller bites, watching them. Give me a little time. But they are clearly runaways. And you? Jimmy hesitated. An old white man with 2 young black girls? Yeah, I know how it looks. George sighed. But they are scared, Jim. Someone hurt them. I can feel it. Thunder crashed outside. Sophie jumped, dropping her sandwich. 10 minutes, George said. Give me 10 minutes to earn their trust. Then we'll do what needs doing. Jimmy nodded slowly. Okay, 10 minutes. But if anything seems wrong, you'll do your duty. I respect that. George returned to the girls. Sarah had picked up Sophie's sandwich and wiped it clean with a napkin. Hey, Soph, she whispered. 5-second rule? Remember. Sophie smiled weakly. That's what Mom used to say. The mention of their mother made Sarah's face close up. George sat down carefully, his knees creaking. Want to tell me about your mom? He asked gently. Sarah shook her head. Sophie looked at her hands. Okay, George said. How about Miss Patricia then? The lady you ran away from? She's mean, Sophie blurted out. She locks the food cabinet and dash. Sophie. Sarah's voice cracked. We promised not to tell. But I'm hungry all the time. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. And she pulls our hair when she's mad. And she says we're too much trouble. And dash, Sarah grabbed her sister's hand. Stop. They'll send us somewhere worse. George's stomach turned. He'd suspected neglect. But this. Listen to me, he said, leaning forward. What Miss Patricia did was wrong. Very wrong. But running away isn't safe either. You could get hurt out here. We're always hurt anyway, Sarah muttered. The words hit George like a physical blow. He thought of his Sarah, how he protected her from every scrape and bump. These girls had no one. What if, he said slowly, I told you there might be another way. A safe place where you could stay together. Sophie looked up hopefully. Sarah's eyes narrowed. There's no such place, she said. Foster homes don't want twins. Especially not dash, she stopped herself. Especially not black twins. George finished quietly. Yeah, I know the world can be ugly that way. But I'm thinking maybe. He took a deep breath. Maybe my home could be that place. Temporarily, at least. Both girls stared at him. Behind the counter, Jimmy pretended not to listen. You don't even know us, Sarah said. True. But I know what it's like to lose family. To be alone. George's voice roughened. I had a daughter named Sarah too. And a wife, Mary. Lost them both 5 years ago. What happened? Sophie whispered. Car accident. Rainy night, like tonight. He cleared his throat. My point is, I've got a big empty house. Plenty of room for 2 girls who need a safe place to land. You'd really want us? Sophie's voice was so small. Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. He can't. The system won't let him. They never let single people foster. Especially not dash. Old guys like me. George smiled. Maybe not. But I can try. If you'll let me. Jimmy approached slowly. Mr. Smith? It's been 10 minutes. George nodded. Girls, I need to make a call. The people who come will want to ask you questions. They might seem scary, but they are here to help. Will you trust me? Sophie looked at Sarah, who bit her lip. Do we have a choice? Sarah asked. There's always a choice, George said. But I'm asking you to choose to trust me. Just for tonight. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Jimmy called social services while George helped the girls clean up their dinner. Within 20 minutes, 2 social workers arrived. A tall black woman named Ms. Jackson and a younger white man who introduced himself as Mr. Peters. I'm going to need to speak with the girls privately. Ms. Jackson said kindly but firmly. George started to stand, but Sophie grabbed his hand. Can he stay? She pleaded. Please. Ms. Jackson hesitated, then nodded. All right. But Mr. Smith, please don't interrupt. For the next hour, the girls told their story. Their mother's death 2 years ago. The string of foster homes. Miss Patricia's neglect and casual cruelty. Sarah did most of the talking, her small voice steady even when describing the worst parts. Sophie pressed against George's side, trembling. And you've been on the streets how long? Mr. Peters asked. 3 days, Sarah admitted. We slept in the park until it started raining. Ms. Jackson made notes on her tablet. You understand we'll need to investigate these allegations about Miss Patricia. The girls nodded. In the meantime, we'll need to find emergency placement dash. I want to foster them, George interrupted. All eyes turned to him. Sorry, I know you said not to interrupt, but I want to apply. To be their foster parent. Mr. Peters frowned. Mr. Smith, the process is complicated. Your age alone dash. I'm healthy. I own my home outright. I have savings, a clean record, and time to devote to them. George straightened in his chair. I know it won't be easy, but these girls need stability. Someone who'll keep them together. The cultural differences dash, Ms. Jackson began. I can learn, George said firmly. Whatever I need to know about caring for black children, I'll learn. These girls deserve a chance. And honestly, he smiled slightly. So do I. Sophie squeezed his hand. Even Sarah's guarded expression softened. Ms. Jackson and Mr. Peters exchanged looks. We'll need to do an extensive home study, Ms. Jackson said finally. Background checks. Training courses. It could take months, and there's no guarantee. I understand. George looked at the twins. But I'd like to try. If the girls are willing. It's not up to them, Mr. Peters said gently. They are minors in state custody. No, Sarah spoke up suddenly. It is up to us. Because if you send us back to Miss Patricia or try to separate us, we'll just run away again. Her chin lifted. And next time, we won't trust any nice old men who offer to help. George felt a surge of pride at her fierce protectiveness. This one was a fighter. Ms. Jackson sighed. We'll take your application, Mr. Smith. But tonight, the girls need to come with us to an emergency placement facility. Sophie's hand tightened on George's. No, please. It's okay, Soph, Sarah said quietly. Mr. George needs time to fix up his house for us anyway. Right? George nodded, throat tight. Right. And I'll visit, if that's allowed. Once you've started the certification process, Ms. Jackson agreed. Girls, go with Mr. Peters to get your things. As the girls walked to the bathroom to dry off, Ms. Jackson turned to George. You understand what you're taking on? Two traumatized children, racial dynamics, your age. I understand it won't be easy, George said. But nothing worth doing ever is. Ms. Jackson studied him, then pulled out a business card. First step is orientation. Next class starts Monday at 6 p.m. She handed him the card. Don't be late. The girls returned, looking small and tired in their damp dresses. George knelt despite his protesting knees. I'll see you soon, he promised. Be good for each other. Okay. Sophie hugged him suddenly. After a moment, Sarah did too. Thank you, Sarah whispered, for the sandwiches and everything. George watched them leave with the social workers, two small figures holding hands as they walked through the rain to the car. His chest ached, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from grief. Jimmy appeared beside him. You sure about this, Mr. Smith? George touched the business card in his pocket. No, he admitted, but I'm sure about them. Outside, the rain began to ease. George drove home slowly, mind racing with plans. Sarah's old room would need new furniture. He'd need to learn about black hair care, cultural considerations, school districts. The house felt different when he walked in, not empty anymore, full of possibility. He walked to Sarah's room and opened the door. Dust motes danced in the beam of hall light. Time for a change, he said softly. What do you think, Mary? Our girl would want this, wouldn't she? The empty room didn't answer. But as George began making lists of what he'd need, he could almost hear Mary's laugh. She'd always said his biggest weakness was rushing in to fix things. Maybe this time, that weakness would be his strength. Monday morning hit George like a truck. He'd spent the weekend cleaning Sarah's old room, his back screaming in protest with each box he moved. The orientation class was tonight, and his stomach churned at the thought. The doorbell rang at 9 a.m. sharp. A younger woman in a crisp blazer stood on his porch, tablet in hand. Mr. Smith? I'm Rebecca Chen from Social Services. Initial home evaluation. George straightened his collar. Right? Yes. Please come in. Rebecca's heels clicked on the hardwood as she followed him inside. Her eyes scanned everything. The dated wallpaper, the family photos, the slight layer of dust on the ceiling fan. Living alone? She asked, tapping notes. 5 years now. George cleared his throat. Coffee? No, thank you. She gestured to the stairs. Show me the children's proposed room. Sarah's room looked bare now. George had packed away the teenage posters, the old softball trophies. Only the lavender walls remained. Planning to repaint, he said quickly. Let the girls choose the color. Rebecca opened the closet, checked the window locks. You'll need safety rails on the beds. Carbon monoxide detector. Updated fire evacuation plan. Already ordered the safety equipment. George pulled out his phone, showing her the online receipts. Being delivered Wednesday. She raised an eyebrow. You're taking this seriously. They deserve serious. Rebecca made more notes. The girls mentioned you met them at a gas station. Yes. In the rain. And you immediately offered to foster them. George felt his face heat. Not immediately. But when I heard their situation. Mr. Smith. Rebecca lowered her tablet. Why do you really want to foster these specific children? The question hung in the air. George walked to the window, looking out at his quiet street. My daughter's name was Sarah, he said finally. She died with my wife 5 years ago. Car accident. I saw that in your file. It doesn't answer my question. George turned back. When I saw those girls in the rain, I thought about Sarah. How scared she'd be, alone like that. And I thought about what Mary, my wife, would do. She'd help. No questions asked. This isn't about replacing your family. No. George met her eyes. It's about giving two girls the family they deserve. Rebecca studied him, then nodded once. The cultural considerations dash. I've been researching. Bought books on transracial fostering, black hair care. Found online forums for white foster parents of black children. He gestured to his laptop on the bed. I know I have a lot to learn. It won't be easy. Some people won't understand. People rarely understand what's right in front of them. Rebecca's lips twitched. True enough. She checked her watch. Orientation tonight. 6 p.m. sharp. Good. We'll schedule the full home study after you complete the basic training. She headed for the stairs. One more thing, Mr. Smith. Yes. The girls asked about you. Several times. George's heart jumped. Are they okay? Safe. Adjusting. Rebecca paused. They've been through a lot. Don't make promises you can't keep. I won't. After she left, George sat on Sarah's old bed. His phone buzzed. A text from Linda next door. Saw the social worker. Everything okay? He typed back, making some changes. Tell you over coffee sometime. The orientation class was held in a fluorescent-lit community center room. George arrived 20 minutes early, hands shaking slightly as he signed in. Other prospective foster parents trickled in. Mostly younger couples, a few single women. He was the only single man, definitely the oldest. First time, a black woman about his age sat next to him. That obvious. She smiled. I'm Gloria. Been fostering 30 years. George. Just starting. Hopefully. Special case. He told her about the twins. Gloria listened, nodding. Brave girls, she said. Braver man. Taking this on at our age. Some would say foolish. Some say a lot of things. Doesn't make them right. The instructor arrived, Ms. Jackson from the gas station night. She recognized George with a slight nod. Welcome to foster parent orientation, she began. This won't be easy. We'll discuss trauma, attachment issues, cultural competency, legal requirements. Some of you won't make it through training. That's okay. Fostering isn't for everyone. George took notes until his hand cramped. Questions swirled. Medical proxy rights, school registration, therapy options. By break time, his head spun. Gloria touched his arm. Overwhelming, right? A bit. He rubbed his eyes. Worth it though. You've met the children already. That's unusual. Most foster parents don't know who they'll get. Is that better? Not knowing. Gloria shrugged. Different. But those girls? They chose you too. In a way. That matters. After class, Ms. Jackson called him over. The girls are settled at Bridgewater Emergency Center, she said. Once you complete initial training, supervised visits can begin. How long? Minimum 6 weeks of classes. Then home study, background checks. She saw his face fall. They are safe, Mr. Smith. Focus on getting ready. That night, George couldn't sleep. He wandered the house, seeing it through new eyes. Child locks needed on the cabinets. Slippery stairs needed rubber treads. His retirement routine would need complete restructuring. His phone lit up. An email from Rebecca Chen. Initial home evaluation, provisional pass notes, resident suitable size financial stability verified safety modifications required recommend cultural competency training follow-up inspection in 30 days. George sat heavily in his armchair. Mary's reading glasses still sat on the side table. He picked them up, turning them in his hands. Am I crazy? Sweetheart, he whispered. Taking this on at my age. The house creaked its familiar sounds. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping across the wall. Life moving forward. His phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Smith, this is Sarah and Sophie's emergency placement supervisor. They asked me to tell you good night. Policy prevents direct contact during evaluation period, but they are doing well. Thought you'd want to know. George's vision blurred. He typed back, thank you. Please tell them I said good night too. He went upstairs to Sarah's, no, the girl's future room. Paint samples littered the floor from his weekend research. He needed to learn about black hair care products, find a culturally competent pediatrician, research local schools. The task list seemed endless. But for the first time in years, the work felt purposeful. His daughter's old jewelry box sat on the dresser, the last item he hadn't packed away. Inside, her favorite bracelet, small silver links with a heart charm. She'd been wearing its twin the night of the accident. George closed the box gently. "Not replacing you, honey," he murmured. "Just making room for more love. Like you and Mom taught me." The next morning, he drove to the hardware store. Tom, the new owner, looked surprised to see him so early. "Need paint," George announced. "For a kid's room." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Kids? Foster kids? 2 girls?" George squared his shoulders. "Got a lot of work to do." "Well then," Tom grabbed a cat. "Let's get you started." They loaded up paint, brushes, child safety locks, window guards, night lights. George's retirement savings would take a hit, but he didn't care. At checkout, Tom hesitated. "Listen, George, some folks might not understand. Small town, you know." "I know. But Mary, she'd be proud. This is a good thing you're doing." George thought of the twins, holding hands in the rain. Of Sarah's fierce protectiveness and Sophie's tentative hope. "Not good enough yet," he said. "But I'm working on it." He drove home, trunk full of supplies. Time to turn possibility into reality. The girls were waiting. The foster parent training room buzzed with chatter. George sat in his usual spot, reviewing his notes from the previous session. 3 weeks down, 3 to go. "Hair care day," Gloria announced, dropping into the chair beside him. She'd become his unofficial mentor, helping him navigate the complexities of the system. "Been studying." George pulled out a notebook filled with terms, protective styles, moisturizing routines, detangling techniques. "YouTube tutorials too." "Look at you." Gloria smiled. "Most white foster parents don't put in half this effort." Ms. Jackson entered, carrying a mannequin head with coily hair. "Today we're getting practical. Everyone find a partner." George paired with Gloria. She watched, amused, as he carefully sectioned the practice hair. "Gentle," she coached. "Work from the ends up." His fingers fumbled with the hair tie. "Harder than it looks. You'll get there. The girls will help you learn." The mention of the twins made his chest tighten. 2 more supervised visits under his belt now, each one better than the last. Sophie asked if she could bring her stuffed elephant when she moves in, he said quietly. Had to remind her nothing's certain yet. Gloria squeezed his shoulder. "But you're trying. That matters to them." After class, Ms. Jackson called him over. His stomach dropped. These conversations usually meant complications. Rebecca Chen's report came in, she said, shuffling papers. "Safety modifications look good, but we've had some concerns raised. About your age, the cultural gap." A community member suggested the placement might not be in the girl's best interest. George's hands clenched. "Oh, you know we can't disclose that." She met his eyes. "How would you respond to these concerns?" He took a deep breath. "My age? I'm healthy, active, financially stable. The cultural differences? I'm learning every day, reading, asking questions, connecting with resources. And the community concerns? Small minds fear what they don't understand." He softened his tone. "I know it looks unusual, but those girls need stability, love, and respect for who they are. I can provide that." Ms. Jackson nodded slowly. "There's still the home study, background checks. I'll pass them." "You sound certain." "I am." George straightened. "Because those girls deserve certainty." That evening, he had his 4th supervised visit. The emergency center's visiting room was bright but sterile, all plastic chairs and motivational posters. Sarah and Sophie burst in, followed by their caseworker. Sophie carried a folder bulging with papers. "Mr. George, look." She spread drawings across the table. "I drew our room." George examined each picture carefully. Purple walls, twin beds, a bookshelf shaped like a tree. "Beautiful," he said, "although I was thinking you girls might want to pick the color yourselves." Sarah, quieter as always, touched one drawing. "Really? Of course. It's your room." Sophie bounced in her chair. "Can we have stars on the ceiling? Jenny in my class has those. Glow-in-the-dark ones." George grinned. "Already bought them." The caseworker cleared her throat. "Remember, girls, nothing's finalized yet." Sarah's face fell. George reached for her hand, then stopped himself, still learning the boundaries. True, he said, but hope's not a bad thing. They spent the hour playing board games and talking about school. Sophie dominated Candyland while Sarah revealed she'd aced her math test. Miss Jackson says you're taking classes too, Sarah said suddenly. George nodded. Learning lots of new things. Like what? Well, today was hair care. He mimicked the sectioning technique from class. Not very good at it yet. Sophie giggled. We can teach you. Sarah does my hair all the time. I'd like that. George watched them exchange glances. What? Miss Patricia. Sarah hesitated. She never bothered learning. Said it was too much trouble. George's jaw tightened. The investigation into their former foster home was ongoing, but details kept emerging. Well, I want to learn, he said firmly. Everything. How you like your sandwiches cut. What stories you like at bedtime. Which songs make you dance. Why? Sarah's voice was small. Because you matter. Both of you. The caseworker called time. Sophie hugged him quickly before leaving. Sarah hung back. Mr. George? She twisted her hands. What if you learn all that stuff and then decide we're too much trouble anyway? His heart cracked. Not possible, sweetheart. How do you know? Because I've been alone too. George met her eyes. And being alone is much more trouble than learning new things. That night, he worked late into the evening. The girls' room was nearly ready. Safety rails installed, new curtains hung, dresses assembled. He'd found a black-owned beauty supply store and filled a cabinet with recommended products. His phone rang. Linda from next door. Heard some gossip at Bridge Club, she said without preamble. About you fostering those little black girls from the gas station. George sighed. Small towns. True. Martha Wilson's making noise. Says it's not right. At your age. With your background. My white background. You mean? George. Linda paused. You know I support you. But people talk. Let them. He looked at Sophie's drawings, now stuck to his fridge. Some things matter more than talk. After hanging up, he sat in Mary's chair. The house felt different now, full of half-finished projects and possibilities. His laptop chimed, an email from Ms. Jackson. Home study scheduled for next week. Final evaluation team includes Child Development Specialist, Cultural Competency Assessor, Senior Placement Coordinator. Please be prepared for intensive questioning. George replied with one line. I'll be ready. The next morning, he drove to the hardware store again. Tom looked up from the register. More supplies. Bookshelf. George showed him Sophie's tree drawing. Special request. Martha Wilson was in earlier. Running her mouth about you and those girls. And? Tom shrugged. Told her my grandkids are mixed. Shut her up quick. George smiled. Thanks, Tom. Just be sure about this. Taking on 2 kids at your age. I'm sure about them. George headed for the lumber aisle. Everything else is just details. He worked on the bookshelf all weekend, his arthritic hands protesting. But when the last shelf went in, curved like a branch, he felt a fierce pride. The home study loomed ahead. Martha Wilson's gossip spread through town. His savings dwindled with each necessary purchase. But every night, he looked at the photo the caseworker had snapped, him with the twins, playing Candyland. Sarah's guarded smile. Sophie's uninhibited laugh. His own face, more alive than it had been in years. Almost there, girls, he whispered. Almost home. The home study team arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. 3 people with clipboards and serious expressions. George had been up since dawn, triple-checking every room. Coffee, he offered. No one accepted. Dr. Martinez, the child development specialist, spoke first. Let's start with your daily routine. How would you structure the girls' day? George pulled out his notebook. School's 3 blocks away. I'll walk them there and back. After-school snacks, homework time, then playtime or activities they choose. Regular bedtime. Research says that's important for trauma survivors. And their cultural needs? The cultural competency assessor, Dr. Washington, leaned forward. Found a black-owned salon nearby for their hair. Church options if they are interested. Their previous foster records mention religious background. Connected with local black parents, group for guidance and community. The senior coordinator, Mr. Banks, made notes. Your age concerns us. Child raising is physically demanding. I swim 3 times a week. Daily walks. Regular checkups. George met his eyes. I'm old, not invalid. And if you become ill, made arrangements with my neighbor Linda. She's agreed to be emergency backup. Plus Gloria from foster training, she's offered support. They toured the house. George showed them the safety modifications, the new bookshelf, the carefully stocked bathroom cabinet. You prepared thoroughly, Dr. Martinez admitted. They deserve thorough. In the kitchen, Dr. Washington opened his recipe book. Soul food. Learning to cook what they might miss from home. Their file mentioned their grandmother's cooking. The questions continued for hours. Discipline strategies. Education plans. Cultural sensitivity. Emergency procedures. Finally, Mr. Banks closed his notebook. We'll have our decision in 48 hours. After they left, George sank into his chair, exhausted. His phone buzzed. The emergency center. Special request, the supervisor said. Girls want to know if you passed. George's throat tightened. Tell them I did my very best. 2 days crawled by. George kept busy, installing the last of the glow-in-dark stars, arranging books by reading level. The call came Wednesday morning. Mr. Smith. Ms. Jackson's voice was neutral. The team has reached a decision. George gripped the phone. Yes. Provisional approval granted. 6-month trial period. Weekly check-ins. Mandatory continuing education. His legs went weak. When? Girls can move in next weekend. Supervised transition period first. He sat down hard. Can I tell them? We're informing them now. First supervised home visit tomorrow at 2 p.m. George spent the next 24 hours in a frenzy of preparation. Fresh sheets on the beds. Favorite snacks in the pantry. New toothbrushes in the bathroom. The doorbell rang at 1:58 p.m. Sarah and Sophie stood with their caseworker, each clutching a small backpack. Welcome, George managed. Want to see your room? Sophie ran upstairs. Sarah followed more slowly, taking everything in. The door opened. Both girls froze. You made the tree bookshelf, Sophie whispered. Like your drawing. George shifted nervously. The stars aren't up yet. Thought you might want to help place them. Sarah touched the lavender walls. Our favorite color. Lucky guess. George watched them explore. There's more. He showed them the closets with new clothes, the art supplies, the hair care station. You learn all this for us? Sarah asked. Still learning? He demonstrated the detangling technique Gloria had taught him. Probably need lots of practice. Sophie giggled. Your parts are crooked. Very crooked, he agreed. Good thing I have expert teachers now. The caseworker cleared her throat. Girls, remember this is just a visit. Trial period starts Saturday. But something had shifted. Sarah sat at the vanity, arranging hair ties. Sophie bounced on her bed, already plotting star patterns. They spent the afternoon planning. School supplies needed, favorite meals to learn, park trips to take. Can we have friends over? Sophie asked suddenly. Once you're settled, George said. Maybe a small welcome party. Sarah looked alarmed. Not too many people. Just who you want. He touched the door frame. This is your home now. Your rules matter. Too soon? The caseworker called time. The girls gathered their bags reluctantly. 2 more days, George reminded them. At the door, Sarah turned back. Mr. George. Yes. Thank you. For learning things. She swallowed hard. And for wanting us. That night, George couldn't sleep. He paced the house, mind racing with plans and fears. His phone lit up, Gloria calling. Big day tomorrow, she said. Nervous. Terrified. Good. Means you care. She paused. Need help settling them in. Could use some backup. I'll bring dinner. My famous mac and cheese. Way to any kid's heart. Saturday morning dawned bright. George waited on the porch as the social services van pulled up. The girls emerged with their small suitcases. Everything they owned fit in 2 bags each. Welcome home, he said softly. Sophie ran to hug him. Sarah walked more slowly, but her hand slipped into his as they climbed the steps. Inside, Gloria's mac and cheese waited. The girls' eyes widened at the spread. Miss Gloria. Sophie hugged her. You're here too. Couldn't miss this. Gloria winked at George. Someone's got to teach this man to cook. They ate together, the caseworker making notes. George watched Sarah take seconds. She never did at the center. After dinner, bath time loomed. George's first real test. Okay. He laid out supplies. Show me how you like your hair done. The girls were patient teachers. They corrected his clumsy fingers, showed him how to braid properly. Not bad, Sarah said finally. For a beginner, bedtime brought another challenge. The girls had shared a room at the center but never had their own beds. What if I get scared? Sophie whispered. Then you call me. George plugged in the nightlight. I'm right down the hall. Promise. Promise. He read them a story, one Gloria recommended about a black princess. Sophie fell asleep halfway through. Sarah stayed awake, watching him. What is it, sweetheart? What do we call you? She asked quietly. George's heart squeezed. Whatever feels right. Mr. George is fine. Or just George. She nodded, eyes drooping. Good night, George. Good night, Sarah. He left their door cracked, the nightlight casting star shapes on the wall. Downstairs, Gloria gathered her things. They'll test you, she warned. Push boundaries, act out. It's normal. I know. Call me anytime. Especially about the hair. After she left, George sat in the quiet house. Not so quiet now. He could hear soft breathing from upstairs, the hum of the nightlight. His phone buzzed. Linda next door. Girls settled in? Getting there, he replied. Martha Wilson's bridge club is buzzing. Half of them think you're crazy, and the other half think you're brave. I'm with them. George smiled. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, small feet padding to the bathroom. Normal sounds. Family sounds. He climbed the stairs slowly, checking the bathroom nightlight, straightening the hallway rug. Sarah stood in their doorway. Can't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. Feels weird. New place. Want some warm milk? Always helped my Sarah sleep. A pause. Your daughter? Yeah. He touched the wall where her growth marks still showed. She'd like you girls. She had a big heart too. Sarah studied him. Okay. Milk sounds good. In the kitchen, he warmed 2 mugs. They sat at the counter, not talking. Finally, Sarah spoke. George! Millimeter! I'm glad you found us. In the rain. He reached over slowly, giving her time to pull away, and squeezed her hand. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. The first week passed in a blur of adjustments. George learned quickly that raising twins meant double everything. Double the laundry, double the homework help, double the midnight calls for water. George! Sophie's voice came from his doorway at 2 a.m. I had a bad dream. He sat up, clicking on the lamp. Want to talk about it? She patted over, clutching her stuffed elephant. Miss Patricia was there. Ah! He patted the bed. Sophie crawled up, small and warm against his side. She can't hurt you anymore. Promise. Promise. The police are investigating her now. She won't foster any more children. Sophie nodded against his shoulder. Sarah has bad dreams too. But she pretends not to. Your sister's very brave. She thinks she has to be. Sophie yawned. For me. George carried her back to bed, tucking the elephant beside her. Sarah watched through half-closed eyes but said nothing. Morning brought new challenges. Hair day. Oh! Sophie squirmed as George attempted cornrows. Sorry. He loosened his grip. Like this? Better. Sarah supervised from her bed, already dressed for school. But the parts are still crooked. The doorbell rang. Gloria. Right on time. Rescue squad's here, she announced, taking the comb from George. Go make breakfast. I've got this. By the time the girls came down, their hair was neat and styled. George had pancakes waiting, shaped like elephants. Sophie squealed. Try my best. The pancakes were slightly lopsided. Takes practice. Sarah picked at hers. We're really starting school today. 6th grade, here you come. George watched her face. Nervous. She shrugged. What if the other kids ask about your situation? Gloria sat down with her coffee. They might. Kids do. Tell them whatever feels right, George added. Or nothing at all. Your story belongs to you. The walk to school felt endless. Other parents stared as they passed. George heard whispers, saw phones recording. Ignore them, he told the girls. But Sarah's hand tightened in his. At the school gate, Sophie hugged him quickly before running to join her class. Sarah lingered. I'll be right here at 3, George promised. Right here. She nodded once and walked away, shoulders straight. George watched until they disappeared inside. Gloria touched his arm. They'll be okay. Will they? Kids are resilient. And they have you now. The day crawled. George cleaned obsessively, reorganized the pantry, called Ms. Jackson 3 times for updates. At 2:55, he was at the gate. Other parents gave him space, but he noticed a few friendly nods. Sophie emerged first, running full speed. "George, I made a friend. Her name's Lily and she has a pet hamster and she invited me for a playdate." "That's wonderful." He hugged her. "Where's your sister?" Sophie's face fell. Some boys were mean to her at lunch. Called her names. George's stomach clenched. Sarah walked out slowly, head down. "Hey, sweetheart. Good day." "Fine." She wouldn't meet his eyes. At home, Sarah went straight upstairs. George followed after a few minutes, knocking softly. "Go away." He opened the door anyway. Sarah lay face down on her bed. "Want to talk about it?" "No." He sat on the edge of her bed. "Okay. Want to hear about my first day of 6th grade instead?" A slight head turn. "Was it bad?" "Terrible. Tripped in the cafeteria. Spilled milk everywhere." Sarah rolled over. "Really? Really? Kids called me Milky Way for weeks." He smiled. "But you know what?" "What?" "Those kids don't even remember their names now. Bad days pass." She sat up slowly. They said you couldn't be our real dad. "Because you're—" She gestured vaguely. "White." "Yeah." She picked at her blanket. "And they said mean things about why you took us in." George's chest hurt. "Sarah, look at me." She did, eyes wet. "People who don't understand love will always try to make it ugly. But they are wrong." "How do you know?" "Because love isn't about matching. It's about choosing. Every day." He touched her hand. "I choose you girls. Every day." Sarah launched herself into his arms, crying quietly. He held her until the tears stopped. "Want ice cream for dinner?" he asked finally. A watery laugh. "That's not healthy. Sometimes the heart needs feeding more than the body." Downstairs, Sophie had set the table with 3 bowls. Ice cream party. They ate sundaes for dinner, breaking every nutrition rule. Sarah slowly relaxed, even laughing at Sophie's chocolate-covered face. The doorbell rang. Martha Wilson stood on the porch, holding a casserole. "Thought you might need a proper dinner," she said stiffly. "Growing girls and all." George accepted the dish. "Thank you, Martha." She peered past him. The twins watched from the kitchen doorway. "They're settling in. They're amazing." George's voice held warning. "We're doing just fine." Martha nodded once. "Well, bridge club's tomorrow. Your usual spot's open." "Not tomorrow. Hair day." He smiled. "Still learning cornrows." After she left, Sarah helped him reheat the casserole. "She doesn't like us," she said matter-of-factly. "She doesn't know you." George served 3 plates. Her loss. That night, checking on them before bed, he found both girls in Sophie's bed. "Sarah had a bad dream," Sophie whispered. "Did not," Sarah muttered. "Just didn't want to sleep alone." George sat on the edge of the bed. "Know what helps with bad days?" "Ice cream," Sophie suggested. "Better. Gratitude." He smoothed their blanket. "Tell me one good thing that happened today." "I made a friend," Sophie said immediately. Sarah thought longer. "You came to get us. Right at 3. Like you promised. Always will." He kissed their foreheads. "Sweet dreams, my girls." In the hallway, he heard Sophie whisper, "See? Told you he'd be a good dad." "Maybe," Sarah whispered back. "But don't call him that yet. Just in case." George's eyes burned. He touched the wall where he'd marked their heights that morning, right beside his Sarah's old marks. His phone buzzed. Ms. Jackson checking in. "Girls settling okay?" He typed back. "Day 1 complete. Some bumps. Lots of love. Remember? Weekly support group tomorrow. Mandatory." George smiled, as if he'd miss it. Every tool, every resource, every chance to learn, he'd take them all. For his girls. For their future. For the family they were becoming, one crooked cornrow at a time. Time moved differently with children in the house. George blinked, and suddenly 7 years had passed. The twins were 13 now, their childhood beds replaced with more mature furniture, their walls covered in pop star posters. "Dad!" Sophie's voice echoed down the stairs. "Have you seen my science project?" "Dad!" The word still made his heart skip, even after 3 years of hearing it. "Kitchen table," he called back. "Where you left it." Sarah appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. You need to tell her about the doctor. George's chest tightened. The dizzy spells had started 3 months ago. The doctors wanted more tests. After her presentation, he said quietly, "Don't want to worry her today." Sarah's jaw clenched, so much like Mary's when she was upset. "You promised no secrets." "It's not a secret. It's timing." He touched her shoulder. "Let your sister have her moment." Sophie thundered downstairs, project board in hand. "How's my hair?" George examined her neat cornrows. He'd finally mastered them last year. "Perfect. Ready to wow them with solar power." "Did you take your medicine?" Sarah asked suddenly. George sighed. "Yes, mother hen. All of them." The drive to school was quiet. Sophie rehearsed her presentation under her breath. Sarah watched George's hands on the wheel, checking for tremors. "Good luck, sunshine," he told Sophie at drop-off. "You'll do great." "Thanks, Dad." She hurried off, board wobbling. Sarah stayed in the car. "I'm telling her tonight if you don't." "Sarah Dash, you're sick." Her voice cracked. "And you're trying to hide it." "I'm getting tests. That's all." He turned to face her. "Nothing's certain yet." "But Dash." "But nothing." He squeezed her hand. "Go ace that math test. We'll talk tonight. All of us." She slammed the car door harder than necessary. George watched her stride away, so tall now, so fierce. His phone rang. "Gloria. You tell them yet?" "Tonight." He pulled away from the school. "Sarah's about to do it for me if I don't." "Smart girl. They need to know." "George." "I know." He rubbed his chest where the pain had started. They've been through so much already, and they survived. Because of you." Gloria paused. "Want me there tonight?" "Please." The day passed slowly. George tried to clean but got dizzy. He sat instead, looking through photo albums the girls' first Christmas with him. Sophie's face lit up at her new bike. Sarah pretending not to cry over the journal set. Their 10th birthday party. The whole house full of kids. Martha Wilson actually smiling as she served cake. Last summer's beach trip. Teenage eye rolls at his dad jokes, but still holding his hands in the waves. His vision blurred. Not from dizziness this time. The front door slammed. Sarah's voice. "Sophie, wait." Sophie burst in, tears streaming. "You're dying." George's heart dropped. "What?" "Tommy's mom works at the hospital. She saw your file." She told him and he told everyone and Dash, Sophie hiccuped. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sarah appeared behind her sister. "I tried to stop her running home." "But Dash, come here." George opened his arms. "Both of you." They came, 13 going on 30 in their worry. He held them close, breathed in their familiar scents. Sophie's strawberry shampoo, Sarah's vanilla lotion. "I'm not dying," he said firmly. "I have some health issues they are checking out. That's all. Promise." Sophie's voice was small. "I promise to fight like hell to stay with you girls." He kissed their heads. "You're stuck with me." The doorbell rang. Gloria with dinner. "Thought we could use comfort food," she announced, holding up bags. "My famous mac and cheese." They ate together, George explaining everything. The symptoms, the tests scheduled, the treatment options. "What do we do?" Sarah asked practically. "How can we help?" "Just be you." George smiled. "Both of you. That's all I need." Sophie picked at her food. What if something happens? Then we deal with it." He reached for her hand. "Together. Like we always have. No more secrets." Sarah pressed. "No more secrets." He touched his chest. "But no borrowing trouble either. Right now, I'm here. Right now, we're family." Gloria cleared her throat. "Speaking of family, there's something else we should discuss." George nodded. They'd talked about this. "Girls," he said carefully, "I want to ask how you'd feel about adoption. Making this official." Silence fell. The twins stared at him. "But," Sophie frowned, "aren't we already families? In our hearts." "Yes." George's voice roughened. "But legally, if something happened to me." "Yes." Sarah cut him off. "Yes to adoption." "Me too." Sophie grabbed his hand. "Can we change our last name to Smith?" George's eyes burned. "If you want." Sarah and Sophie Smith. Gloria smiled. "Has a ring to it." Later, after Gloria left and Sophie went to bed, Sarah lingered in the kitchen. "Dad." "Millimeter." "I'm scared." He opened his arms. She came to him, tall enough now to tuck her head under his chin. "Me too, sweetheart." You can't leave us. Her voice broke. Not like everyone else. Hey. He pulled back to see her face. Listen to me. Whatever happens, you girls are the best thing I ever did. The best love I ever found. Better than your real daughter. Sarah was my first daughter. You and Sophie are my now daughters. My heart's big enough for all of you. She hugged him hard. I love you, Dad. Love you too, my fierce girl. That night, he found them both in Sophie's room again, like when they were small. Just for tonight, Sarah said quickly. Because of everything. Scoot over then. George sat on the edge of the bed. Want to hear a story? About your Sarah? Sophie asked softly. No. About my Sophie and my Sarah. The night I found them in the rain. The girls curled close, knowing this story by heart but needing it tonight. Once upon a time, George began. A lonely old man saw two bright souls shivering in the storm. His chest hurt, but not from illness. From love. From knowing that whatever came next, these girls were his miracle. His phone buzzed. A text from Ms. Jackson. Adoption paperwork filed. Court date in 3 weeks. Sarah Smith. Sophie Smith. His daughters, in every way that mattered. The future was uncertain. But right now, holding his girls close, George knew one thing for sure. Love had saved all 3 of them that rainy night. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Sarah sat ramrod straight, holding Sophie's hand. 16 now, they look more different than alike. Sophie in bright colors and braids, Sarah in muted tones and a natural afro. He'll be okay, Sophie whispered. He has to be. Gloria brought the more vending machine hot chocolate. Your dad's tough. Sarah checked her phone again. No updates from the surgical team. The tests had shown a tumor. Operable, the doctors said, but risky at George's age. He'd gone into surgery 6 hours ago. Girls! Dr. Martinez appeared in scrubs. Is asking for you. They followed her through sterile corridors to recovery. George looked small in the hospital bed, tubes and wires everywhere. My beautiful girls, he rasped. Sarah checked his monitors while Sophie straightened his blanket. 3 years of pre-med classes had taught Sarah to read the numbers. Pressure's a little low, she muttered. Stop doctoring me. George caught her hand. Sit. Both of you. They perched carefully on either side of his bed. Surgery went well, he said. Got it all. But... Sarah heard the hesitation. But recovery's gonna be tough. Chemo maybe. He squeezed their hands. Need you to be strong. Sophie started crying. We can defer college. Stay home and help Dash. No. George's voice strengthened. You're both going. Sarah to Johns Hopkins. You to Berkeley Art. No arguments. Dad Dash. I didn't raise quitters. He smiled tiredly. Or girls who give up their dreams. Sarah's throat tightened. You're our dream too. And I'll be here. But you need to fly. He closed his eyes briefly. Gloria's moving in to help. Linda too. I'm covered. A nurse appeared. Time for rest, Mr. Smith. Outside his room, the girls huddled together. Is lying, Sophie whispered. About being okay. Sarah nodded. I saw the scans. It spread more than they thought. So we stay. No. Sarah straightened. We do what he wants. But we make plans. They drove home in silence. The house felt empty without George's presence. Sarah went to his study, opening his laptop. Help me with this. Sophie read over her shoulder as she typed. Emergency care plan for George Smith, daily check-ins via FaceTime. Gloria staying Monday through Wednesday, Linda Wednesday through Friday, weekend rotations between us, medical power of attorney forms, college withdrawal procedures if needed, budget reorganization. He'll hate this, Sophie said. Tough. Sarah kept typing. His turn to be taken care of. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, rehab sessions, and college preparations. George grew stronger slowly, but the shadows under his eyes remained. I'm calling Berkeley, Sophie announced one night. Telling them I'm not Dash. You are. George sat carefully in his recliner. Both of you are going. But Dash. No buts. He pointed to the wall where their heights were marked. See those marks? Each one's a step toward your future. Can't stop now. Sarah brought him his medicines. We can study closer to home. Girls. George took their hands. Listen carefully. I'm sick. Yes. Might die sooner than we'd like. Yes. But I won't die happy if you give up your dreams for me. You're our dad, Sophie protested. Exactly. and a dad's job is to launch his kids into their best lives. He smiled, even when it hurts. Later, Sarah found Sophie in their old room, looking at photos. Remember when he tried cornrows the first time? Sophie laughed wetly. Total disaster. Sarah sat beside her. Remember him chasing off Tommy Wilson when he made fun of your art? Remember him at our adoption hearing? How he cried. They looked at the photo, all three of them outside the courthouse, officially Smith's. Sarah's phone buzzed. Gloria is not telling you everything, she said without preamble. Cancer's aggressive. Doctors give him maybe 2 years. Sarah closed her eyes. We know. He wants you in college. We know that too. Gloria sighed. That man loves you girls something fierce. We love him fiercer. They spent the summer making memories. George insisted on their annual beach trip, even though he couldn't swim now. Just want to see my girls in the waves, he said. Sarah noticed how he recorded everything on his phone. Sophie building sandcastles, Sarah reading under the umbrella, both of them asleep in the car. Making memories, he said when she asked. 4 later, move-in day approached too quickly. George insisted on driving them himself, Gloria riding shotgun to take the car back. Barclay first. Sophie's art studio dorm overlooked the bay. Call every day, George told her, holding tight. Paint something beautiful. I love you, Dad, she sobbed. Love you more, sunshine. At Johns Hopkins, Sarah helped him up the stairs to her dorm. Pre-med. He touched her medical textbooks proudly. My brilliant girl. I'll learn everything, she promised. How to fix you. You already fixed me. He cupped her face. That night in the rain. You both did. The goodbye destroyed her. She watched him drive away, Gloria at the wheel, and felt 6 years old again, scared and alone. Her phone buzzed. A video message from George. His face filled the screen, filmed in his study. My dearest girls, I made a video for every day you're gone this semester. For when you need your old dad's voice. Sarah sank onto her bed, tears falling. Another buzz. Sophie this time. Got one too. He's such a dad. The best dad, Sarah typed back. That night, she called him. How's the dorm? He asked immediately. Quiet. Sophie okay. Called an hour ago. Already painted her walls. Against regulations, they said together, laughing. A pause. Dad. Millimeter. Promise you'll tell us. If things get worse. Promise. He breathed heavily. But promise me something too. Anything. Live your dreams, baby girl. Full out. No holding back for me. Sarah clutched her phone. I love you, Dad. Love you more. Always will. After hanging up, she opened her medical textbook. Oncology section. I'll find a way, she whispered. To keep you with us. Her phone buzzed. Tomorrow's video from George waiting. Outside her window, rain fell softly. Like that night years ago, when love found them all. 5 years later, the graduation gowns were too hot for June. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead as she searched the crowd outside Johns Hopkins Medical School. There, a flash of Sophie's bright yellow dress, Gloria's silver hair, and George in his wheelchair. Her father had beaten the odds. 2 years had stretched to 5 through sheer stubbornness and experimental treatments. He was thinner now, tired easily, but his eyes still sparked with life. Dr. Smith, he called as she approached, pride radiating from him. My girl's a doctor. Sarah knelt beside his chair, hugging him carefully. Not officially for 3 more weeks. Close enough. He touched her face. Your mom and sister would be so proud. She knew he meant both sets of sisters, her birth sister and Sophie. The years had taught them family could hold multiple truths. Sophie bounced over, camera in hand. Family photo time. Dad, straighten your tie. George smoothed his suit jacket. The same one he'd worn to their adoption ceremony 11 years ago. It hung loose now, but he'd insisted on wearing it. My 3 favorite people, he said as Gloria joined them. Together again. Sarah caught Sophie's eye. Time for their surprise. Actually, Dad. Sophie pulled out an envelope. We have news. George opened it slowly, hands shaking slightly. His eyes widened. Barclay Medical Center, Pediatric Oncology Fellowship. He looked up at Sarah. You're coming home. Got the official offer yesterday. Sarah squeezed his hand. I'll be working with your doctors, learning everything I can, and I got the art therapy position there, Sophie added. Working with kids in treatment, Both of you. George's voice cracked. Back in California? Both of us. Sarah straightened his tie. You didn't think we'd leave you alone, did you? Gloria sniffed loudly. Told you those girls weren't going anywhere. They went to dinner at George's favorite diner. The one he'd taken them to after the adoption was final. The owner, Mike, rushed over to congratulate Sarah. First round of milkshakes on the house, he announced. For our new doctor. George watched his daughter share a chocolate shake, just like they had as kids. Tell me again about your programs. They explained, Sarah's fellowship focusing on innovative cancer treatments, Sophie's art therapy program helping young patients process their journeys. Following in your footsteps, Sophie said. Helping kids who need it, just like you helped us, Sarah added. George wiped his eyes. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Back home, the house looked exactly the same. Their hike marks still lined the wall. Photos covered every surface. Sophie's art hung everywhere. Remember our first night here? Sarah asked, helping George to his recliner. Like yesterday, he settled back with a sigh. Two scared little girls who didn't trust anyone. Until you made us hot chocolate, Sophie said, and showed us the stars on our ceiling. They're still there. Sarah smiled. I check every visit. George's breath hitched slightly. Pain or emotion, Sarah couldn't tell. She checked his pulse automatically. Stop doctoring me. He caught her hand. Just sit with your old dad. They curled up like they used to. Sophie on the floor by his feet. Sarah perched on the arm of his chair. Gloria brought hot chocolate. Tell us again, Sophie said softly. About the night you found us. George smiled. Once upon a time, a lonely old man saw two bright souls shivering in the storm. Sarah mouthed the words along with him. She'd heard this story 1,000 times, but it never got old. And somehow, George continued, those two little girls saved him right back. We had help, Sarah said. You taught us how to trust again. You taught us love doesn't have to match to be real, Sophie added. George touched the family photo on the side table, all three of them at the beach last summer. Real as it gets. Later, after Sophie and Gloria went to bed, Sarah sat with George. Your latest scans, she said quietly. I looked at them. Course you did. He smiled tiredly. Verdict, Dr. Smith. 3 months, maybe 4. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry, Dad. I tried to find Hey. He gripped her hand. You gave me 5 extra years. 5 years of watching my girls become amazing women. It's not enough. It's more than I ever dreamed that rainy night. He closed his eyes. My only regret was not finding you sooner. Sarah laid her head on his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. We found each other exactly when we needed to. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sophie upstairs. Dad okay? Tired but good, she typed back. Love you sis. George dozed in his chair. Sarah watched his chest rise and fall. Doctor's mind cataloging symptoms. Daughter's heart memorizing moments. Tomorrow they'd meet with his medical team. Start the process of moving him to Berkeley, where both girls could care for him. Sophie already had an apartment lined up near the hospital. But tonight was for remembering. For gratitude. Sarah stood carefully, not wanting to wake him. On the mantel, their adoption photo caught her eye. 3 beaming faces outside the courthouse. Beside it, a newer photo, Sarah in her white coat, Sophie with her art therapy certification, George in the middle looking thin but proud. And there, the oldest photo, George's first family. Mary and young Sarah smiling at the camera. Thank you, Sarah whispered to their faces. For sharing him with us. George stirred. Talking to ghosts. To family. She kissed his forehead. All of them. They'd have loved you girls. He smiled sleepily. Like I do. Love you too, Dad. Sarah adjusted his blanket. Get some rest. Big day tomorrow. Every day's big. His eyes drifted closed. When you've got miracles for daughters. Sarah watched him sleep. This man who'd seen 2 scared girls in the rain and opened his heart without hesitation. Her phone buzzed. The hospital confirming tomorrow's transfer arrangements. Dr. Sarah Smith, listed as primary physician. Outside, rain fell softly. Full circle, she thought. A lonely man, 2 lost girls, and the family they built together. Not matching on the outside, but perfectly fitted within. Love had saved them all that night. And love would carry them through whatever came next. Sarah touched the height marks on the wall one last time before heading upstairs. Tomorrow would bring changes, challenges, tears. But tonight, in this house filled with memories and miracles, everything was exactly as it should be. Perfect, in its own imperfect way. Just like family should be.